The sensory assault begins long before the eyes adjust to the gloom. It is the scent that claims you first, a suffocating mixture of oxidized iron and the sour, damp breath of ancient earth. Then, the auditory ghost, a scream that shatters against the limestone ribs of the earth but never finds the sky. Above, the sun crashes onto the sands of the Colosseum in a violent display of golden theatricality, casting long shadows of heroes and monsters. But beneath that stage, in the subterranean veins where the daylight is an outlaw, a different Rome existed, one that the empire preferred to leave nameless. We are taught to see gladiators as tragic, enslaved icons, men whose courage was bought with blood and whose names were etched into mosaics. Yet, there is a hidden manuscript written in the dark, a story the textbooks have long suppressed. It is the story of the women who were not met in the arena, but beneath it those captured in the wake of conquest and delivered into the hands of men who had been systematically stripped of their own humanity. To find the truth, one must look past the epic poems and into the cold, indifferent ink of the administrative ledger. Rome was a machine of efficiency, and its cruelty was meticulously documented. In a fragment of an accounting record salvaged from the ashoked ruins of Pompeii, dated approximately 62 CE, a Lanista merchant of human slaughter accorded the acquisition of 12 barbarian females. He noted their purchase at a reduced price, designated specifically for the recreational use of his fighters. The handwriting does not waver. There is no tremor of shame. He records these lives with the same flat indifference one might use for a shipment of grain or a head of cattle. The entry concludes with a chilling economic projection. The cost of the women was to be recovered within 6 months through private rentals. In those 2 words, private rent, is an abyss of suffering opens, revealing that, to the Roman mind, a captured woman was not a person, but war spoil, merchandise, an expendable flesh. As the Roman legions tore through the wild frontiers of Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, the mechanics of enslavement followed a predictable, grim logic. While the men were often put to the sword or sent to the brutal exhaustion of the mines, the women faced a spectrum of fates. Some vanished into the domestic servitude of the elite. Others were funneled into the state's public brothels. But the darkest destination was the Ludus, the gladiator school. These institutions were high-stakes investments, where fortunes were poured into the training and medical care of men meant to die for the public's amusement. These fighters were volatile, dangerous, and prone to the kind of desperation that fueled the fires of rebellion. To keep the weapon sharp, but the man obedient, the empire used the bodies of female prisoners as a currency of control. In the labyrinthine depths of the Ludus Magnus, archaeologists eventually uncovered narrow, lightless cells with rusted iron chains still bolted into the weeping stone. For centuries, it was assumed these were for the punishment of disobedient men. But modern forensic analysis of the bone fragments found there told a different story. These were the remains of young women, their skeletons bearing the undeniable signatures of repeated systematic trauma. The hierarchy of this horror was absolute. Within the walls of the gladiator schools, status was measured in survival. The veteran fighters, the survivors of a dozen bouts, were granted the first rewards of the flesh, while the novices were forced to participate in the degradation as a rite of passage. Refusal was not an option. To show mercy was to show weakness, and in the cult of the gladiator, weakness was an invitation to the grave. We see the psychological shrapnel of this system in a surviving wax tablet from Herculaneum, where a gladiator named Marcus wrote to his mother. Between descriptions of his training and his victories, he confessed a haunting truth. They say it is our right, our reward. but their eyes haunt me even when I sleep. This guilt, scratched into wax 2 millennia ago, proves that even the most brutalized men recognize the atrocity they were part of. Yet, the Roman state viewed these women as entirely invisible. They were recorded only by their origins. The Gaul, the Briton, the one with the scar labels, used to erase their identities long before the hot iron of ownership ever touched their skin. By the 2nd century, the normalization of this violence had reached a clinical level of detachment. Galen, the famed physician of the era, left behind medical journals that detailed the specialized diets and combat wounds of the fighters. Hidden among his observations is a passage regarding the females kept on the 2nd lower level. He noted that they frequently succumbed to fevers that resisted treatment. His recommendation was not for better conditions or mercy, but a simple report to the owners, who concluded that the cost of replacement was significantly lower than the cost of care. This was the ultimate victory of the Roman logic, the total reduction of a human life to a line item on a balance sheet. The suffering was not an accident. It was a calibrated part of a system that believed some lives were destined to be consumed so that the empire might flourish. As the sun set on the arena above, the true darkness was only beginning to stir in the tunnels below, where the cost of Rome's grandeur was paid in a currency of screams and silence. The cruelty of Rome was never a secret. It was a festival. As the narrative of the ludus deepened, the violence spilled from the private tunnels into the public consciousness, transforming into something the empire called divine entertainment, while the gladiators used the prisoners in the shadows of the barracks. The Roman public demanded their own share of the degradation. This manifested in a form of execution that modern history often sanitizes, damnatio ad best. While we are familiar with the image of criminals or martyrs thrown to the lions, there was a far more sinister variation reserved for female captives of high status, the daughters of tribal chieftains and captured queens. Rome did not merely wish to kill these women, it wished to unmake them. They were forced into theatrical executions, morbid reenactments of classical myths, where the prisoners were made to play the victims of divine sexual violence. Under the gaze of 50,000 spectators, the stories of Pasiphae and Europa were brought to life through brutal, literal means. The Roman historian Suetonius records that under Emperor Nero, these spectacles were choreographed with such sadistic precision that the line between theater and atrocity vanished entirely, turning the collective scream of the stadium into a symphony of approval. This brings us to the most uncomfortable realization within the stone walls of the Colosseum, the duality of the gladiator himself. These men were simultaneously victims and perpetrators, a paradox that makes their history truly haunting. They were enslaved, brutalized from childhood, and forged into human weapons who knew they would likely die for a crowd that viewed them as disposable. They were victims of a system that offered them no freedom, yet, when granted a flicker of power over those even more vulnerable, most chose to wield it. The prisoners in the tunnels were not their enemies. They were terrified women caught in the same machinery of empire. Some, like the Greek gladiator nomads, chose the whip and the mockery of their peers over participating in the violation of a Gallic prisoner. But such acts of defiance were rare. The system was designed with a perfect, dark genius, by giving the brutalized man someone else to brutalize. Rome ensured that the anger of the slave was directed downward at the helpless, rather than upward at the masters. The aftermath of these lives is a void in the historical record. The women who survived the Ludus and the arena were not granted the dignity of a grave. They were discarded, sold to the cheapest brothels, or sent to the slow death of the sulfur mines once their utility had expired. Rome raised triumphal arches to its generals and minted the faces of its emperors onto gold. But for the women of the tunnels, there are no memorials. This forgetting was not an accident. It was a final act of violence. To erase a victim from memory is to justify their suffering as an inevitability of progress. As historian Mary Beard famously noted, the greatness of Rome was built upon a sea of suffering that we prefer not to examine too closely. If we truly look into those empty cells, we begin to recognize that the mechanisms Rome used to dehumanize categorization, the labeling of barbarians, and the aestheticization of violence did not vanish when the empire fell. They merely changed their masks, waiting for new justifications in new eras. In the twilight of the 5th century, as Christianity became the state religion and the games began to fade into the dust of history, a lone priest wrote a letter that serves as a chilling prophecy. He expressed relief that the lethal combats were ending, yet his soul remained uneasy. He feared that by simply banning the games, Rome was hiding its darkness rather than curing it. He understood that the appetite for watching the destruction of the vulnerable does not disappear. It simply migrates to new theaters. Today, tourists stand in the center of the Colosseum, taking photographs where thousands once cheered for the violation of the nameless. We tell ourselves we have evolved, that we are the civilized ones. But the lesson of the tunnels remains. Injustice does not require a monster at the helm. It only requires a society that agrees to look away. The ghosts of the Underarena do not ask for our pity. They demand our recognition. They remind us that the most dangerous lie any empire tells is that its cruelty is a necessity of order, and that some lives are simply the cost of doing business.